So that will open up the period of questions. I'll invite people to just take the microphone if you have a question. So for recording purposes, I don't know if someone wants to open up the period.
Gregor, Maria, a quick question for Marisa. There are, I don't disagree at all with the need for struggle, and there's some evidence to support this. If you don't have some torque, as Peter was suggesting as well, then why are you going to pay any attention? But there are other factors, and you just might want to consider them, and I think you probably know them well. Probably apart from Coca-Cola, which is maybe a special circumstance because of the Killer Coke campaign and a whole bunch of other things, a lot of the other firms that you're looking at in terms of the development of transnational private governance, it has a footing in national public governance. So the cases that we've looked at, like Carrefour and others, if it weren't for the French establishment of all kinds of mechanisms, which does not explain why it's going to work, it's just, it's there, so it gives a climate in which it can develop. The other thing, of course, is there's a piece in the, I think it's the American Sociological Review, McConnell et al., 2015. It looks at 500 campaigns with Fortune 500 companies, and it reinforces the thesis, but it's not necessarily about transnational labor governance, but it's just any kind of campaign has a reaction mode where you tackle the company, and thereby they have to develop a capacity to respond, and having that capacity to respond then makes them somewhat dependent on the people who are leading the campaigns. In other words, their raison d'etre is because they're there to react to this. So they almost then have an institutional footing. So a couple of ideas, but the conflict is clearly very important.
My question is to Professor Lucas. So,
Could you speak louder, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Sichen. I'm a doctoral candidate at McGill's Faculty of Law. Thanks for the presentations. And my question is that I think mostly you talked about transnational private governance, and I was wondering whether during your research, whether you have considered to, within your research scope, consider the public governance, and if yes, I would be happy to know your impression or your findings about the role of states and international organizations, including their documents like policy documents or legislations. If not, and why not your research didn't consider about the public governance? Thank you.
Hi, Maria Gonzalez from University of Oviedo. I would like to ask Michele. You were referring specifically to French law. Why only France? Is that the case? And I think you were referring to the duty of due diligence. Is there any other country that might be relevant in that regard? And if I may add another one for Marisa, what I understand that the union now has direct contact. You know, picking up the phone is great, but what are they getting out apart from the other person answering the call? Just the capacity to unionize, just consultation. I'm sure you know what I'm saying. Thank you.
It's a question for Tony, I guess. Yeah, sounds a really interesting project. About time somebody did something. I suppose a couple of things that you haven't, well, one thing that you did mention, but I wonder whether you're underestimating its significance here, and that's the state. That in so many of the emerging economies, obviously China, to a major degree, but Brazil and Russia, the nature of the state and its interaction with the policies of multinationals, seems extremely close. I wouldn't. Well, you might have met Lazzarini from Sao Paulo in Brazil, who's written this book on state capitalism and has linked a lot of these countries together under that heading of state capitalism, where the firm itself is an instrument of state policy to a significant degree. And then I guess that also relates to the question of finance and putting that somewhere so that it doesn't get lost, because clearly a lot of these organisations have a very, goes back partly to state funding, the nature of who owns these firms and the capacity of ownership, but also about how they manage their financial assets using offshore.
Yep.
I'm not saying that they're, I don't know the degree to which they're different to a lot of Western multinationals, but I think there is something more that, and that also relates to the question of the state and what you're doing as somebody who's trying to be an economic decision maker, the degree to which you're a servant of the state, but you're also trying to save yourself from the state, so you're looking for ways to get funds out. I mean, I think it would be, I hope that in this big project you'll be able to capture some of those nuances about the state and finance, as well as the more traditional HR type issues, which hopefully do that as well.
I think it should be time that we leave some time for the participants to answer. And if I can add a short comment regarding Marissa's presentation and Peter's as well. You've been discussing implicitly about how to create mobilization and political action within, the labor movement as a whole. And I was particularly interested in hearing Marissa talking to us about the threat that labor organization faces upon just relying on a phone call, because I'm particularly, as a researcher, interested in better understanding the genesis of collective action and how to create a counterpower on behalf of trade union organizations. And for me, it's very intriguing just to hear someone speaking on behalf of a global union federation, especially because I've been doing research in the mining sector, just saying, okay, so why would we have to campaign? Because you're a trade unionist. That's your job. That's your job, to create mobilization and leverage. So I would like to hear you regarding this specific challenge. I don't know how you want to, do you want to, maybe Mikael, we could just follow the order of presentations since you've been asked.
Well, if I understood correctly, you asked me why I focus specifically on the French law. Well, the answer is that the French law, in my opinion, is so far the most advanced piece of legislation in this subject, because it's the only one that is hard law, requires a specific duty of care, and so something that goes beyond a simple statement, or publish a statement on what you're doing. And third, linked to the second point, it has a global scope of application. So, for instance, we have in Italy an interesting law, not only in Italy, on joint liabilities for wage within the subcontracting chain, but it's just its scope, its geographical scope of application is limited to the Italian territory. So yeah, those are the three reasons why I did that. Very simple.
Okay, I'm going to answer the easier questions first, and maybe just comment on the harder questions. So the easy question is, what do you get from picking up the phone? And it's a real resolution to labor disputes in various developing countries, where they will go ahead, and often it's about firing local management for being recalcitrant, for having anti-union practices, and replacing them with more labor-friendly management. So you get immediate results, and it's a benefit to the company because it doesn't cost as much time and effort. There's not the uncertainty of whether or not there'll be a campaign. And it's a benefit to the union for the same reasons. You're not spending the money, you're not spending the time. So there's an immediate benefit. And now the bigger question, though, there were a couple questions raised about national governments and the importance and the enduring indispensability of public governance. I'm a political scientist, so I teach my own students that we need the state, right? Only states have a monopoly of force, and at the end of the day, that monopoly of coercion is what backs everything. Laws don't matter unless they can physically drag you to prison or kill you, right? So at the end of the day, that's power. And what we're talking about is power. But what I'm interested in is how labor can almost approximate that. They'll never be states, but through constant campaigning, right, which isn't just PR campaigns or corporate social responsibility, they're physically disrupting supply chains. They're ruining profits, right? If a consumer campaign goes really well, there's a financial cost, there's a real material cost. So there's pain to the company, and it's in a way like using violence. So what's interesting about these relationships the IUF has with Unilever, Nestle, Coca-Cola, Danone, is that there's always this shadow of hierarchy, just like with the state, right? If you don't pay your taxes or you don't pay your parking ticket, or whatever you did, I know you did something, there is this looming shadow that someone can drag you to prison or kill you or use violence against you. And this is true also with the IUF and these labor organizations. So even though they can pick up the phone, if it comes down to it, and this has happened in some of these cases, they will go back to campaigning if necessary, which is in a way saying we will use violence if necessary. Now, not violence as in you're going to kill somebody, but we're going to, if you're using just-in-time production and that part has to be delivered within 2 hours or else you can't make the car, we're going to strike exactly at that node so that part doesn't get delivered on time. In interviews, I've had global union staff say, look, we show them, we have a strike fund for these workers in Pakistan. The campaign's gone on for 2 years. We will pay them at their full salary for an additional 2 years. Do you want the campaign to go another 2 years? And Unilever or whatever will say, actually, no, I didn't, and they should. Look, we've got the money. We're willing to give them pay and benefits, so we can keep going. We can keep fighting. And when I think about it from a really big picture, if you think about historically, this is how power gets consolidated in every macro and micro process that we study in politics or perhaps in sociology, right? So Europe was just a bunch of entities that were feuding and fighting, and it was just what, centuries of killing each other. I'm American, so I just say these things really brazenly. But over time, they consolidate into nation states that decide, look, France and Germany are better off not fighting because we have a historical memory of how terrible that is. Let's never do that again. And I'm wondering if these processes can happen through labor relations on a much less impressive, more micro level, but can this happen, right? So I maybe have a bit of selection bias when I choose the cases of private governance that don't really involve states, although I think Gregor makes a good point. That is always there, and that's part of the context. I do need to explore all these variables, and that's excellent advice. But I'm right now selecting these more extreme cases because I want to see how far can we push it? How far can we sort of approximate these relationships where they get tired of fighting. And that's the story for everything significant politically that I could think of.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, I'll just make a comment on this thing about political action and the role of some of these activities. I mean, I've been in meetings with European Transport Workers Federation and the Commission. One very strange meeting where all the kind of social partners, the employers, were sat around this kind of table, and then around the outside were all the member states from the government. And you can see the look of the faces on some of these people from the member states when these discussions were being made. We'd all arranged to go for lunch, and the General Secretary of the ETF was pulled out, and when we got back after lunch, everything was sorted. And there was this kind of thing of the number of employers in particular member states were not happy with the proposals from the Commission. It was clear that the number of countries were, and it was all just kind of fixed. But behind that was this kind of threat of action, which they knew would happen. And there's a very similar thing with the International Transport Workers Federation and the Maritime Labour Convention and flags of convenience, because they know ships will be stopped. And the first countries to sign up to the Maritime Labour Convention were all the flag of convenience states, because they knew that if they didn't sign up to this, the big companies like Maersk and these others would stop flagging out. So it's this interesting thing about how you connect the companies in the states, and then get those connections in those kind of political, kind of things. So when we've had the consumer things, well, IKEA and stuff, it embarrasses them and things, but we're not able to control the trucking market, the road haulage market that goes with the pressure that we put on the companies. So there's that kind of, it's how you connect those things up that we struggle with in certain sectors as opposed to others. So where's this going now? Oh, Patrice, I thought you noticing you were going to answer all the difficult questions.
Is it John? Or? Okay. So, yeah, Glenn's point about the state and finance. I mean, I agree. I mean, in the presentation, I talked about the role of the state being not only important in emerging market multinationals, but actually under-researched in multinationals more generally. I gave the case of the US multinationals exploiting opportunities created directly or indirectly by the US state, ways in which technological developments in US multinationals developed out of the military-industrial complex and so on and so forth. So I'm completely with you. I think in relation to emerging market multinationals, it obviously has a slightly different flavour, dimension. And one of the sectors that we're interested in exploring this is in relation to sport. And there's a development, a tendency amongst many Chinese individuals recently become wealthy out of the formation of a company or whatever, to buy up sporting organisations in other countries. The latest in the UK is Wigan Athletic falling under Chinese ownership. There's a string of football organisations, but it extends in other sports in other countries. And it's tempting to see this as simply the ego trips of self-made business people, but it's much more than that. Those investments have to be approved by the Chinese state. It's very likely that it's part of a coordinated approach towards, I suppose, the exercise of soft power, the way in which these ownerships are giving Chinese individuals owning these companies seats on relevant associations, that they're then using that to exert development over FIFA, location of the World Cup eventually. There's some sort of grand strategizing going on, we don't know exactly what. But so, I mean, the tentacles of the state are very evident in looking at this phenomenon. I completely agree. In terms of finance, I mean, I didn't use the word finance, but I talked about owners. So in the Indian case, for example, if you want to understand the way Indian multinationals develop, you have to understand the sort of ownership structure, the family-based foundations, and arguably the consequences in terms of the way investment decisions are evaluated, perhaps the way that these companies express or think about their social responsibility. All of these are things that flow from a distinctive form of ownership and finance. And the network of returnee entrepreneurs is also a distinctive element of how Indian companies are owned, governed and financed. So yes and yes, I agree on both counts.
John, Patrice, do you have an ending comment? We have 4 minutes left. I don't know if you want to add something.
Just on the resource firms, I think there's a very interesting contrast between Australia, as I understand it, and Canada. I mean, clearly resource firms require social license to access, and that's a key aspect, and that's a big. General Motors requires less social license than a forestry or mining company in terms of investment. It will have legitimacy, but it doesn't have to invest in that same way. There's also an institutional mechanism in Canada that ups the game because of the impact and benefit agreements, which are pretty much compulsory in any development which touches the lands and the heritage lands of indigenous people. So already there has to be a whole capacity on the part of the resource company to negotiate these impact and benefits agreements, which aren't necessarily very transparent. They're private agreements, but it shows that they have that capacity to do that. It's just an institutional contrast, which is interesting, which gives leverage and has a lot of potential as leverage, which I think will become increasingly common.
My question is just a follow-up question on Marissa on the international campaign. I mean, it almost sounds in your presentation like the playing field has shifted. It is quite straightforward for international unions to drive these international campaigns, but we know it's actually quite difficult. I'm really wondering what is. If something has changed, is there a greater image sensitivity of multinational companies so that they have to take these greater into account? You talked about institutionalizing some of these employment relations practices. What is there exactly institutionalized? Is there certain standards about the institutions? Are there constraints on employers that won't go away in the next recession? So is there a certain kind of longevity of these institutions you are talking about? And so I'm still wondering if it is actually so easy that there's a constant threat and then the employers just cave in. So if you just could further expand on your interesting campaigns.
And I think it's going to be the last question, so you can.
Well, it's unions figured everything out, and now there are no more poor people. It's brilliant, really. Short answer to what should be a longer answer is that workers and unions have become more strategic when it comes to transnational campaigns. I think, even 5-10 years ago, they were almost exclusively reactive, and workers weren't thinking about power and conceptualizing it in terms of, just throw things at the wall and see what sticks. So I think they've become more strategic, but you're absolutely right about the limitations. Most fail. Most of these campaigns still fail. And I think you're absolutely right. I need a better definition of what is institutionalized. How do I know that these arrangements with the transnational companies have longevity over time? So that is something to work on. I think you're absolutely right.
So I think that we'll close the session. I thank you all. It's been a very rich one, so I think it's time for a break. Thank you very much.